The next question is your actions to stop the burning of all fossil fuels by 2030? Is that your aim?
Not only the burning, but also the extraction.
And burning. And so stop the use of all fossil oils
for the government to draw up a legally binding plan to do so and work with international.
And by 2030 have no burning of fossil fuels of any sort.
Correct.
Hello everyone. This is the first of a few episodes I intend to produce, looking at a concept I'm calling Enviro-Imperialism, when the language of environmentalism is employed to serve corporatist or imperialistic goals. You've just heard a clip of Just Stop Oil spokesman Ben Larson, affirming that the group's goal is the cessation of use and extraction of fossil fuels by the year 2030. On the face of it, this would seem to be anathema to the fossil fuel companies. Whatever the implications for the rest of us, absent some radical act of reinvention, it would mean they would all be completely out of business within the next 6 years. For an historical comparison that might shed light on this issue, I'm going to look at Murray Rothbard's classic book, The Progressive Era. I say classic as I think it is the most insightful work on how big business and the state utilize left-wing ideology to serve their ends, profit with the former and power with the latter. Rothbard opens the environmentalist section of his book by writing, quote, "The conservation movement, past and present, has generally been painted in sweetness and light, as disinterested nature lovers leading the people in a war against corporate interests who wished to exploit and plunder natural resources. The actual facts were quite different." End quote. Rothbard describes how during the 1890s the US government began placing tens of millions of acres of forested land in the West off limits to loggers. This was in response to pressure from conservationists in the East. When keen conservationist Theodore Roosevelt became president, this figure lurched into the hundreds of millions. This was carried out under the direction of Gifford Pinchot, a conservationist whom Roosevelt made the first head of his newly formed Forest Service. Both men believed that the state must act to scientifically manage natural resources. At first glance, we might assume this would go completely against the interests of the logging industry, who would surely want access to as much woodland as possible to profit from. This was not universally the case, however. President Roosevelt himself commented that the great users of timber are themselves forwarding the movement for forest preservation. End quote. This seemingly counterintuitive position makes sense when you consider that by withdrawing woodland from use, the government was preventing competitors from entering the marketplace and appreciating the value of privately held forests. Leonard Bronson, the manager of the National Lumber Manufacturers Association, wrote candidly that, quote, "From a selfish standpoint alone, the heavy timber owners of the West are heartily in favor of the reserves, for the mere establishment of these reserves has increased the value of their holdings very heavily by withdrawing from the market timber which would otherwise be competitive." End quote. Rothbard actually identifies 3 groups who benefit from this. The first, as we've just seen, are existing businesses kneecapping their competition. The second are the upper-class people who wish to repress further growth and thereby preserving both their own enclaves of wealth and the natural scene around them. And finally, there are the experts and technocrats, the professional bureaucrats and managers of the natural resources. Rothbard points out that what really puts lie to the notion that this had anything to do with conservation was that the lumber industry also lobbied for higher tariffs on imported wood. If they had truly been keen to preserve the great American forests, they would have done exactly the opposite. Speaking of things that don't make sense, there is not exactly a parallel, but certainly a comparison here with Western countries shutting down their industries to lower their carbon footprint, only to import the products those industries produced from elsewhere. Whatever the goal of this is, it is clearly not to protect the world from the threat of carbon. Obviously, if the lumber industry had nakedly campaigned for the government to reserve forest land in order to increase their profits, whilst driving up the price of wood for everyone else, this would have been unpalatable to the American public. The scheme had to, therefore, co-opt the conservation movement. Rothbard writes about how the leading environmentalist magazine, Maxwell's Talisman, was secretly funded by the Western railroad companies. These companies had received 15-mile grants of land on either side of their tracks. They realized that the government taking land out of the marketplace would push up its value. One long-term consequence of government management of woodland is the absolutely apocalyptic forest fires we've seen in recent decades.
We can talk all day long about supporters of Just Stop Oil, what they would like our energy generation stats to be. The point is, if we don't make this plan, if we don't put a plan in place by 2030, there is no plan to deal with catastrophic wildfires.
That was Ben Larson of Just Stop Oil, again, citing catastrophic wildfires as one of the reasons we need to, well, just stop oil. This is, in my opinion, an example of pseudo-environmentalism being used to avoid addressing genuine environmental issues. Blaming everything on carbon emissions is a get-out-of-jail-free card for environmentally destructive policies. By contriving one huge and utterly unfixable issue, unfixable without enacting the biggest kill-off in human history, then no action needs to be taken to actually fix any issue. In a 2007 paper, forest consultant Alison wrote, quote, "For most of the 20th century, US federal fire policy focused on suppressing all fires on national forests. The goal was to protect timber resources and rural communities, but this policy ignored the ecological importance of fire. North American forests have evolved with fire for thousands of years. Fire returns nutrients to the soil, encourages growth of older, fire-resistant trees, and promotes establishment of seedlings. Decades of fire exclusion have produced uncharacteristically dense forests in many areas. Some forests, which previously burned lightly every 15 to 30 years, are now choked with vegetation. If ignited, these forests erupt into conflagrations of much higher intensity than historical levels. Grasses, shrubs, and saplings in the understory now form a fuel ladder, through which flames can climb to the forest canopy, killing entire forest stands. The fire problem is exacerbated by decreasing federal timber harvests since the late 1980s. In the absence of fire, and with reduced timber harvests and thinning, numerous small-diameter trees have proliferated. Stressed trees compete for scarce water, sunlight, and growing space." End quote. So how does this relate to Just Stop Oil and the wider modern environmentalist movement? Obviously, if all fossil fuel use was stopped by 2030, that would be bad for the fossil fuel companies. But no one who isn't utterly insane thinks that such a thing could possibly happen. In spite of the optimism of activists, humans will remain utterly dependent on fossil fuels for many years to come. I'm not suggesting that oil companies are funding activist groups in order to kneecap their competitors, but it is a de facto reality that leaving it in the ground will profit some companies over others. The simplistic binary of oil companies versus environmentalists doesn't work any better than it did with loggers. Just out of curiosity, who does fund these groups? Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion are partly funded by the Climate Emergency Fund. This is a charity established by billionaire heiress Eileen Getty, the granddaughter of oil tycoon John Paul Getty. Getty put $900,000 of her own money into the fund. That might sound like a lot, but in 2023, Miss Getty purchased Brad Pitt's estate for $33 million. The website for the Eileen Getty Foundation has a section on sustainable living. It is rather curious that a billionaire oil heiress is paying activists to throw soup over paintings in art galleries, where commoners go to view art. It does rather play into the view that carbon restrictions are really a way of recreating a two-tier society, a way of returning the plebs to serfdom. I'm not sure what Miss Getty's reaction would be if the same activists threw anything over the artwork which doubtlessly hangs on her walls. Another major supporter of both of these activist groups is Sir Christopher Hohn, a billionaire hedge fund manager. It goes without saying that, by virtue of their wealth, Miss Getty and Sir Christopher will be completely exempt from any of the carbon-cutting restrictions that fall upon the rest of us. I doubt very much they are bothered by the £15 required to drive through a ULEZ zone. This is all reminiscent of Rothbard's writing on the well-to-do Eastern dilettantes involved in the conservation movement 100 years ago. Quote, "Many of the wealthy conservation crusaders prided themselves on having abandoned materialism on behalf of such higher, non-material ideas as parks and forests." A woman's representative declared at a meeting of the National Conservation Congress that, "We feel that it is for us, who are not wholly absorbed in business, to preserve ideals that are higher than business." End quote. This is, if you like, a fourth group who benefit from conservationist policies, the conservationists themselves. In addition to the business classes and the bureaucrats profiting, wealthy environmentalists get to play out an eco-spiritual fantasy without ever incurring the cost of that fantasy. That falls upon the rest of us. Without drawing too simplistic a conclusion as to what is going on here, there is certainly a reoccurring pattern playing out. Thank you for listening. Murray Rothbard's book, The Progressive Era, has actually been made freely available online by the Mises Institute, and that's in both written and audio format. I will link to that, as well as the other sources I've drawn upon, in the info box.